What do you see?
Let's see here. Hold on a second. Looks like I see your complete uh, slideshow here.
You do.
Looks like it's trying to broadcast. Let me.
Okay.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Synthetics 101, an exploration of trends and impacts. My name is Grace Rowan, and I'll be your moderator. I am assisting Aisha, the Assistant Director for the Illinois Higher Education Center for Alcohol, Other Drug, and Violence Prevention, and we are very excited to be hosting today's event. Before I hand over the microphone, I have a few housekeeping items to cover about today's webinar in the GoToWebinar platform. For those of you new to using GoToWebinar, you will see the control panel on the right of your screen. This is where you'll find the question box that you can type and submit to at the end of the presentation. All attendees are normally muted, but Matt said he welcomes attendees to hop in at any time to ask questions. Just unmute yourself before doing so. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Matt Vogel. Matt lives in Southern Oregon and has worked in higher education for 16 years in both teaching and administrative capacities. He is a lively and sought-after speaker on a variety of health-related topics, one of his specialty areas being that of substance abuse. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here with everybody. I'm glad you're all on the webinar, and I think you all live in Illinois. I want to just say Illinois is my birthplace. So I was born in LaSalle, Illinois, and lived in that area for the first 9 years of my life, and then started to move all over the place. So yeah, I have a soft spot for Illinois. I still have family that are there. And I actually came last spring to Bloomington, where I have family as well, and presented for the Illinois Higher Ed Center and did a session of full day training on, different drug trends and different associated health topics related to it. So I'm really excited to be here. We'll have an interesting session, I hope, today. And as Grace stated, I'm really open to conversation. Usually I'm a pretty engaged speaker. I try to talk a lot when I present and get people talking with each other. And that's a little bit more difficult on a webinar, but I still think we can do it. So you're always free to chat in a question or ask a question using the option on the control panel, but you can also come on in and we can talk. I might even have some questions for you and try to get a little bit of perspective from people if you're willing to unmute yourself. So without further ado, I do have my first question for you is why did you decide to participate in the session today? So everybody's really busy. I know you have a lot going on. Right. So, but what is it? Why did you decide to spend this period of time today, this hour and a half in this session? So I'm curious if you want to chat that in, and remember in the chat, if you hit, you can have the option to chat to everyone, the entire audience, or you can have the option to chat to just some people. If you chat in to everyone, my gosh, this guy is boring me, I'm falling asleep. Just remember that I will see that. So be mindful, right? As we always say with our online digital activity. So if you could chat in why you decided to participate today. I'd love to see some of that. Or comment in if you want to just unmute yourself. Okay, I just chatted in. I love Illinois and I'm the facilitator. Did you all see that? Okay. Good. Somebody when you put this in the question box, that's fine too. We'll find it there, or the chat box. Learn more about what I should know. That's it. Nobody else. There we go. Good. E-cig use in the field of health promotion. What's up to date? What's happening for sure. Learn more about the topic. Love it. I want to know what the drug use trends are since I have a little sister growing up in synthetic. Yes, absolutely. And synthetics are a fascinating one. We'll get in. We're going to talk today about synthetics as sort of a key feature area, but we're also going to talk about general drug dynamics and a lot of different things will come up for sure. So want to better work with your students for sure. And I think when we're more knowledgeable, when I know for myself working, with college students a lot, I intentionally, voluntarily left my full-time role at the university last year, and I've been doing so much contract work, but I still adjunct at the university and teach drugs and society or drugs and behavior classes there. And I just know there's a much more rapport that we get with students when they feel we have a sense and understanding of different topics that they're talking about and that they're interested in. So great. Okay, so we'll stop it there. I think there was some good questions that people came in with, but we'll continue. So here we go. We have some images of different drugs. We have all kinds of things. We have LSD up there on the upper left. And on the bottom left, it could be a powder of anything, any sort of powder that's being, it looks like, and there's a needle. So it could be any number of things. On the top right, we have psilocybin mushrooms, which are definitely becoming more popular when we think about, some of the different areas of research, and psychedelics have made sort of a resurgence, which we'll talk about later. We have cannabis flowers there on the right middle. And then we have two kind of mysteries here on the upper middle. Anybody know what that one is? Any guesses? Go ahead and throw it in either the chat option or the question option if you think you know it. And then the bottom right, this one I'll give to you. These are the plants that comprise a tea called ayahuasca. And one of those plants is a natural monoamine oxidase inhibitor, and the other one contains a compound called dimethyltryptamine, or DMT, and it's NN-DMT. Which monoamine oxidase in our body, it's an enzyme, it quickly metabolizes, it quickly breaks that down. But when you have a MAO inhibitor working at the same time, then that drug can take effect in the brain. It's become more popular. It was used historically a lot in South America, and now it's becoming a little bit more trendy over the past 5 years, people going down to take ayahuasca and talk about their experiences. So I don't know if anybody tried to answer. Nobody did. Oh man, that's okay. Top middle, we have kratom, and we'll talk more about kratom later. It's not a synthetic per se, but it relates to opioids. So I want to make sure we address that as well. Okay, so moving on from there, if you've seen me present ever, I kind of talk about this perspective. This is Nancy Reagan. I had a student really excited once. I showed this picture. I said, who is this? I travel sometimes, go to other universities or high schools and conferences and community groups and present and do trainings. And I asked a high school student, who is this? And she said really excitedly, that's Judge Judy. So it's not Judge Judy, this is Nancy Reagan from the 1980s. She started a campaign called Just Say No to Drugs in 1986. It was very well intended. And like I think many of our efforts around drug education, it was really well intended, but didn't really land for the majority of people. It really tried to simplify a really complicated topic. The 80s were also a fascinating time in the world of drug history when it comes to policy and mandatory minimum sentences and incarceration and the death of Len Bias, a very famous basketball player in 1986, and crack cocaine coming on the scene. There was a lot going on at the time. And it was an interesting perspective. Again, really well intended. I sort of like this to play on those words, just say no. Let's really encourage knowledge and empowerment, critical thinking skills, discussion. How can we allow young people to talk about this in a meaningful way, and how do we meet them where they're at in that meaning, instead of throwing judgment at them or whatever it may be, but being able to talk about it. And I think this is a really important, just a few slides I have to just to zoom out and think about drugs in general, you know, I do think we create risk if we overstate potential harm. We also create risk when we minimize potential harm. And we see this a lot in the world of cannabis. Depending on someone's perspective, they're often willing to overstate potential harm, but also minimize potential harm. So we have to be mindful of that. There's also a risk in overstating potential benefits, and there's a risk in minimizing potential benefits. So it's an interesting thing when we think of molecules in general or substances in general. Sometimes there is an application or use for them. We acknowledge that when it comes to a lot of pharmaceuticals or whatever it may be, but a lot of times some students particularly will overstate potential benefit, especially cannabis, when it comes to cannabinoids and different impacts potentially that these have on health. You'll see a lot of students specifically overstating potential benefits based on sometimes really shaky data that, you know, isn't really there, or it's very cherry picked, something like that. Now, there's another piece. Whenever I talk about drugs with students in general, I talk about confirmation bias. We are in a state, I believe, in our society right now that we really like to have our own opinions validated, and it gets people living in what's called an echo chamber. So if everything you see and hear through your social media, through your YouTube, through your Google, you know, everything is already what you like and already what you believe, it's really difficult for people then to hear things outside of that echo chamber, outside of those walls, and even the people we surround ourselves with, the information we allow ourselves to see. So again, I'll come back to the example of cannabis. I see this all the time with students, especially students who love cannabis. They're very quick to point out all the positives, really not minimize any challenges that may come up, regardless, even if it's concentrates, smoking dabs, whatever it may be. And so it's an important one to look at, to ask people to say, hey, are you willing to openly look at your bias and explore that with me and look at it in a different way? Okay, so a couple more things here. I want to offer this to people. This is a document that I created. I was getting a lot of feedback from people. They said, I want a tool to have discussion, particularly with college students or maybe even older high school students, around substance use. Instead of, if a student comes to me and has questions or really wants to inquire, and this first came up for me about 10 years ago. I had a student ask me, like, Matt, I'm curious about MDMA. I might want to try it, or what we call ecstasy or Molly. And she said, but I'm getting just information from the internet and then my friends, and I don't really have anyone to talk to about it. I said, okay, so my option in that moment is to say, well, don't do it, it's illegal. That person leaves the interaction pretty disempowered, lacking information. But so instead, I chose to sit with her for about 45 minutes and have a pretty nuanced conversation. These are some of the questions I asked her, and I felt like I wanted to get these in one place. Now, if you want this document, email me and I will send you this PDF. Print it out, use it. You fully have my permission. I don't care. I put it on the bottom, not to be duplicated without permission. Here you go. You got my permission. And you wouldn't need to read these like a script, but some of these questions I think are good to get at the critical thinking. We want young people to take a moment before the prefrontal cortex is fully developed to really think through decisions. So instead of in a 1-second split decision, someone walks into a party and someone hands them a shot or hands them something to smoke or hands them a vape pen, whatever it is, that they've thought through some of these things beforehand. So these are questions, right? What is my motivation? Why would I want to do this? What are the primary reasons? What's my family history? What are other personal factors around my own stress levels in my life? Do I know the dose? Is it pure? What about purity? What's my mindset going into this? What are my expectations? Who am I going to be with? What's the setting and the environment I would be in? Is it safe? Do I know these people? Are there health risks? What would the people in my life feel about my decision who care about me? Would I let people down? Are there potential legal consequences? And then other factors that are just open, maybe they want to talk about. These types of things, great conversation starters, I think really important. So my email was on that first page. I'll give it to you again. I'll make sure you have it before the end of this session. Absolutely contact me. If you want it, I'll send this to you. Really, I found it to be a really good tool. And then just the term synthetic when we think about this, right? So a synthetic, a substance made by chemical synthesis, especially to imitate a natural product. This is essentially the Oxford definition of synthetic. It can also relate to other things, synthetic ideas, etc. But when we think about it in the context of this webinar, something that is happening to imitate a natural product, all things that derive from a natural product, and then how those things are, there's an attempt to imitate them. So that's kind of the premise of what I want to talk about related to that. And I think just because I'm going to bring this up a little bit throughout the session, I want to make sure you all know this. I think a lot of you probably already do, but I wanted to review it anyway. So Schedule 1 versus Schedule 2. There are 5 schedules according to the federal government. And in 1970, a law was passed called the Comprehensive Drug Act by Nixon. And what happened, this essentially in 1973, the Drug Enforcement Administration was created. And in 1973, these 5 schedules of drugs were created. I didn't list all 5 because I think the distinction here is between Schedule 1 and Schedule 2. So Schedule 1 drugs are considered to have, by definition, a high potential for abuse and no accepted medical use at all. Schedule 2 drugs also are thought to have a high potential for abuse, but have some accepted medical use and application. So Schedule 2 drugs, you can put any restriction on them you want. So, cocaine is actually Schedule 2, as you can see here, but you cannot go to Walgreens and get a prescription filled of cocaine. It can be used very specifically as an anesthetic in certain types of surgeries. There's many other options, so it's very not used that much, but it's there. You can see methylphenidate, which is brand name of that is Ritalin. Amphetamine, brand name of that is Adderall. So you can put restrictions on it. You cannot go to the pharmacy and get a 12-month prescription of Adderall. So Schedule 2 drugs can have limitations on them. Schedule 3 drugs are thought to also potentially have some potential for abuse, not as much as Schedule 1 and Schedule 2, and then it goes down the line from there. A lot of people who really analyze this critique this heavily because, like, a lot of benzos are in Schedule 4. And then the big conversation piece is around marijuana or cannabis being in Schedule 1, since we have a lot of states that have medical marijuana laws, and the National Academy of Science paper that came out in 2017, the big document, did show there's some medical application. Some of those benefits are clearly overstated, but there can be some application of especially certain cannabinoids in certain scenarios. So that one, there's a lot of debate around that. That's why, but federal law supersedes state law, and this is why anybody in a legal state, like where I live in Oregon, where it's legal and we have medical laws, every person that uses it here technically is in violation of federal law. Now, for the average consumer of this, is the federal government going to care or get involved with that? No, they don't have time or resources to deal with it. The last thing I want to say with this, though, for Schedule 1, any drug in Schedule 1 can be researched. So through approvals by the FDA and the DEA, any of these drugs can be researched. So right now there's a resurgence of studying some of these drugs, even cannabis. There's more research going on, but also psilocybin, mushrooms, LSD, MDMA, or what we call ecstasy or Molly, as I stated. There are approvals for a lot of research going on with those, and at schools like Johns Hopkins Medical School, University of Wisconsin, Madison, Harvard, UCLA, medical school, University of Arizona. There's been research projects where people have Columbia University, but where people are consuming psychedelics or other compounds, and then they're really trying to study it, pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics and the outcomes, and looking at psychological reactions, all kinds of things. The original MDMA study started in 2003, went to 2008, and that was specifically looking at post-traumatic stress disorder. Could MDMA be a tool and a tool to use in therapy for people with PTSD? And I'll talk about those outcomes a little bit later. So there's debate right now, and the reason you should know this as well, it is tracking this way that MDMA will probably be moved to Schedule 2 by the year as soon as 2021 or 2022, based on the research that's currently happening. So we're probably going to see some shifts with some of these drugs, but a lot of the synthetics I'm going to talk about, some of them I'll talk about today, like synthetic cannabinoids. A lot of them got put in Schedule 1. And what happens is a process called putting something in Schedule 1 is an emergency Schedule 1. So the DEA can say today, right now, this compound, whatever it is emergency Schedule 1, and then it's illegal as of this minute, and then we're going to take a year to understand if it should stay in Schedule 1 or if it should move to Schedule 2 or 3 or just be unscheduled. So that's the process of that. So a lot of synthetic cannabinoids, a lot of synthetic cathinones, which I'll talk about, got put into Schedule 1 immediately by an act that was passed in 2012. That doesn't mean a lot more aren't still out there, but that's happening. That will happen. We'll see that on occasion. Okay, any questions so far about that? Or thoughts to share? I can't tell if you're engaged with me or not. I don't know. I have no idea. Are you? You can give me a virtual thumbs up, but I want to pause sometimes and ask if there's any questions sometimes when I talk about a concept. Okay, I don't see any. Okay, I'll give it 10 more seconds. Okay, so we'll move on. Here's a couple areas of law that I mentioned. There was something called the RAVE Act in 2003 that they were really trying to wrap their hands around the rave culture and the drugs involved with the rave culture. And this really essentially, this law dealt with places of production of synthetic drugs, and that any house or unit or building that's used for this is going to be, even if that drug is not actually illegal and listed as a Schedule 1 drug, but if it's sort of similar to some other drugs, that they're going to treat it as if it was a full-on drug house, so to speak. And then we have the Synthetic Drug Abuse Prevention Act 2012. This is where a bunch of the synthetic cathinones and a bunch of the synthetic cannabinoids, I don't really like to even call that synthetic marijuana. Most people call it synthetic cannabinoids, and I'll explain why in that distinction. A lot of them in one swoop in 2012 were put on emergency Schedule 1. And then there's something called the Federal Analog Act of 1986, and this legislation it's pretty light. It doesn't have a lot of oomph to it, but it basically had this in the language said if things are being produced or made for human consumption that are mirroring or similar to or analogous to an analog to other drugs like MDMA particularly, then charges could be brought if that's the intent of it is for human consumption. So I have on here for human consumption now. This is one of the things, though, that now when I don't know if you've seen like packaging for some of the synthetics, especially 10 years ago, around salvia, not necessarily synthetic, some of them were, but cannabinoids or bath salts, things like that, they would say specifically on them, not for human consumption. And as long as they had that tag on them, they would skirt all regulatory processes like we have for alcohol or other pharmaceuticals through the FDA. All of that regulation would be skirted, and also it would skirt this act by just saying on the package, not for human consumption. So I want to start off by talking about a plant, and it's going to give context to something related to MDMA. I'm curious if people have heard of this plant. It's called cat, and it's used as, and you can see this gentleman here has a big chunk of those leaves in his mouth, and he's chewing it like tobacco. And this is used a lot in Egypt and other parts of Northeast Africa, parts of the Middle East. Cat is a plant that has stimulating properties, but when you chew the leaves, all of it as a whole plant unit, and you chew that like tobacco, you'll get stimulated, but more like a double or maybe triple shot latte from Starbucks. But there is a compound in the plant that's very strong. That's a stimulant, and that is called cathinone. So we learned in the 1930s, we figured out that this plant actually had some psychoactive compounds, but we weren't sure exactly what they were until later. So again, if you just take a plant and then you take an isolated compound from that plant that's psychoactive, and now it is much more potent. It is much stronger, right? So same with the coca plant. Coca plant, similar. People chew the leaves of the coca plant. It's got stimulating effects. It helps with altitude sickness. It's seen as a very indigenous spiritual plant in a lot of parts of the world, in the South America particularly. But if you extract cocaine hydrochloride from it, it is 100 times stronger. So again, when we isolate these very specific compounds, that's what happens. So here's an image, what you can look at. Here we have on the top right, cathinone. That's what is derived from cat. It's very similar structurally to amphetamine. And there's a bunch of other stimulants on here. So you can see below cathinone is something called methcathinone. Now the one on the top, cathinone, is natural. Now remember this thing of synthetic, which is essentially mimicking or imitating natural products. The one right below it, methcathinone, is synthetic, and that is just people going into a laboratory and saying, what's the molecular structure of cathinone? Okay, I'm going to do some alterations, put an extra methyl group onto this, whatever it is. And now this drug is more fat soluble, gets into the brain quicker, is maybe a little more intense, and it's synthetic. So it's not the exact same thing. And then we have some other ones on the bottom, mephedrone, methylone, and then this one on the bottom right called methylene dioxypyrovalerone, MDPV. This drug was sort of structurally created knowing it could be some sort of stimulant. It was actually synthesized in the 1960s, and people were prescribed this drug for chronic fatigue syndrome. So they would give them this stimulant for chronic fatigue syndrome, and then very quickly, medical providers were like, wow, I gave that person a 30-day supply, and they came back in 10 days wanting more and really enthused about it. And this was a trend that people were seeing, and they decided to completely stop prescribing it. But it just lived kind of out in space because drug scheduling didn't happen until 1973. So this drug was unscheduled. It just didn't exist. It wasn't out there. And so what happened, this was the first drug that started getting sold as, quote, bath salts. Now, bath salts have nothing to do with the bathtub or taking a bath. They were just a package name for something so you could sell it legally, and it would say on it, not for human consumption. And in 10 years ago, the majority of those were this drug, MDPV, and then other synthetic cathinones like methcathinone and there's many, started getting sold as bath salts as well. Now, MDPV now currently got put in Schedule 1 once we learned more what was going on with it, and some of the other synthetic cathinones have as well, but not all. And because you can make minor little tweaks and adjustments to that, and now you have a new compound, right? That may or may not technically be scheduled. So it's interesting. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up now. The synthetic cathinones are, again, what we associate with bath salts, but synthetic cathinones are the #1 thing that is being adulterated and mixed into MDMA or Molly or ecstasy. So if somebody goes, I would talk to students about this. They go and to a music festival and someone sells them Molly, right? Or they tell them it's Molly. I said, hey, if we even did a screening test on it, but if we brought it into a lab and did a more drill down test and got more granular with it, we would clearly, the majority of these are not pure MDMA. There's a lot that have a lot of other drugs mixed into them, but synthetic cathinone, or quote bath salts, and then methamphetamine are the most common ones being cut into that. So let's talk quickly, if we could, about MDMA, because this history of this drug is probably most relevant to this whole thing we're talking about with synthetics. The synthetic movement of drugs essentially was born somewhat, not fully, but somewhat out of this world of MDMA. So let's zoom out, talk about it a little bit, and then we'll go on. And students are very curious about MDMA. Molly or ecstasy, whatever we would call it, has had a staying power, I guess you could say, in terms of drug trends, and people are very curious about it. And I was just at a university in the Midwest and did some presentations there. Half the questions I got were about Molly, half the questions that I got were about Adderall in finals week. So it was interesting, but let's talk about it. So I want to just real quick, quick history here. In 1912, this is when this drug was first synthesized by Merck Pharmaceutical Company. They found no use and no function for it. So MDMA is an old drug. It's been around a long time. This picture of this gentleman you'll see here is Alexander Shulgin. I asked my class one year, do you know who this is? And someone said, is that your dad? I said, no, I'm very flattered, but no, it is not. There's Alexander Shulgin. He's a well-known chemist who has worked for, I believe, Dow Chemicals in the 50s and 60s, and he developed a lot of patents, and is a really brilliant guy. But he got the right in the 70s to produce drugs for the government, and he had a Schedule I license. He was able to produce drugs, and he started to synthesize a lot of different drugs and became really curious about them in his own way. So in the 1970s, he resynthesized MDMA and figured this out somehow, and tried it on himself and felt like maybe there's a value to this. So he started sharing it with his friends who were therapists, and they were giving it to people who had trauma. So people who had all kinds of trauma, or people who had marital issues and they needed to kind of communicate better in their marriage, etc. So that's how it was primarily used. And then in the early 1980s, out of essentially Dallas, Texas in 1981, some people got really interested in this drug and started to make it and produce it. And it was sold in bars. It was just everywhere. It was fully legal. You could go into a bar and say, I'll take a beer and I'll have MDMA. At that point in 1981, it got more into a party dynamic, and people started calling it ecstasy. So the people who were producing it said, MDMA sounds boring. What do we want to call this? Let's call it ecstasy. That's got such a good name to it. Now, this caught attention of the government by the mid 80s. They said this is really getting out of control, and so they banned it. They put it on emergency Schedule I, as I talked about before, in 1985, and they debated this drug actually for 3 years. And actually, the DEA administrative law judge at the time, Francis Young, he believed it should be Schedule III or II. A lot of therapists actually testified and said, we do think it has a medical value and application, but yes, we don't like the whole party dynamic. We think there's a real risk with that, but there might be a medical application. In 1988, the administrative law judge of the DEA just said, no, we're going to make it permanently in Schedule I, and that's where it's lived ever since. But starting in 1985, once it became outlawed, who got involved with it? It became a lot of drug dealers and drug producers, because they saw the popularity of it rising and they saw potential. Now, what also got realized at the time was making pure MDMA was more complicated and more expensive, especially getting the precursor compounds you need to make it. And so people started cutting in other drugs with it. So they might sell a pill of ecstasy that would be, 40% MDMA, 40% methamphetamine, and 20% whatever, caffeine or baking soda, whatever they needed to do it, just to continue to increase profits. So that became a massive issue, is drug adulteration related to this drug. Now, what happened, people still continued to sort of use it, and maybe even some therapists were using it underground, and the DEA decided to approve a study that started in 2003 in South Carolina, and it was a 5-year study. They took people who had treatment-resistant post-traumatic stress disorder, and they put them in this 5-year study, and in that study, they took MDMA a total of 3 times. That was it. So, and this study's actually been replicated all over the world, and they're doing one for first responders and ex-military and fire and police officers. There's currently other studies like this all over the world going on. And here's the outcomes of that study. So the CAPS is the clinician assisted administered PTSD scale. If you score above 50, you're considered to have pretty severe PTSD. So this is what happened with that study. When people came into the study, their average CAPS score of the participants, there's about 21 people, I believe, it was about 80. The 5-year study occurred. They were doing a lot of therapy the whole time, a lot of behavioral restructuring and cognitive, looking at cognitive distortions and all kinds of stuff they were really looking at therapeutically. 2 months after treatment, after the 5-year study, the CAP score were about 30. And they said, well, maybe that's just because the study ended. So then about 4 years later, they tracked the people the whole time, and the CAP score was in the 20s. So it had this kind of staying power. So this really opened up people's eyes. The organization who did this study is called MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. They have met with people in the Pentagon to really talk about PTSD in a real way. And this is the push to get this drug put in Schedule 2. And the limitation would be you can't go get a prescription again at Walgreens, but it would have to be administered carefully, thoughtfully, with proper screening of people's cardiovascular health, other things. Purity would be really high, and it would be given to people in the moment for therapy. So that's interesting, right? Now, here's the complexity of this is maybe there's this application for this, but then we know that people can overdo it, misuse it, use it on a Friday, use it on a Saturday, really hurt their serotonin system of their brain and their body. If you're taking certain pharmaceutical drugs and you mix this, they're very contraindicated. If someone's taking a monoamine oxidase inhibiting antidepressant and they take MDMA, they can actually die from that. You can get what's called serotonin syndrome. So this is the thing. You have this research protocol where people are screened, there's medical professionals, the drug was made in a Schedule 1 lab, some person didn't get it from a random person on the street. Very different context than I'm going to go to a party and take MDMA because someone said it's pure and I feel like it, right? It's different. Now, where did the word Molly come from? In the early 2000s, there was this push to get pure MDMA again, and everyone in the drug world knew it was very adulterated. And so they said, this is pure. We're going to sell it instead of in pressed pills. We're going to sell it in a powder form, and we're going to call it Molly. And that's short for molecule. And now, though, if I bought 10 Molly from 10 different people on the street, it would be impure, mostly. So this is a great website. If you're curious about this website, highly recommend it, ecstasydata.org. They don't just look at ecstasy or Molly or MDMA, but they look at all kinds of drugs. And it's a lab based in Sacramento, California, and people can send a pill or a little bit of powder to them with money, and they will test it and then post it on the website, and they'll do a really detailed test. So they'd be able to say, hey, I was looking at this recently. There's a pill with the Tesla symbol on it, and I forgot where it came from, what country, but they tested it and they said it does have there's certain drugs in it, but it has a lot of MDMA in it. It has 256 milligrams per capsule. So on that website, it says if you come across this, it's well beyond what any therapeutic dose would be or anything like that. They said split it in half. So it's a fascinating website, because then other ones, you'll see these pills. This came out of wherever, Portland, Oregon, and it has this symbol on it, and they'll test it and it'll say this was 80% bath salts. This is synthetic cathinones or whatever it may be. So this is where we're at. This is so common, where people go and they buy a drug from someone they don't know at a music festival or a party, whatever it is, and they're taking who knows what. There's a drug, I believe I have it on, yes, PMA, paramethoxyamphetamine. There was 4 young people in the UK died on the same night. All of them had that drug in their system, and all of them had taken a pill, and then 2 or 3 hours later took another pill, and that were kind of slow to metabolize PMA, and it can be toxic in higher doses, and they all died. So there's a huge risk with certain synthetics right now. A lot of them are not tested. We don't really know what they are, what the outcomes are. We don't know the dose. People don't have any idea what the dose is that they're taking with this. And when they're taking any mix of these synthetic cathinones, again, which could be sold to them as MDMA, if they're taking a stimulant for ADD, that will have a synergistic effect. If they have a cardiovascular health issue, is obviously contraindicated, because any sort of stimulant like that could have an adverse reaction for people. There's just so many different things that can be cut into it. So that website's amazing. Very interesting, and my one place of confusion is I think it's illegal to send drugs in the mail, so I'm not sure how guess people just do it, and I guess the assumption is if they're going to that lab, then it's a PO box, then it's okay. But I'm not really. I have a little lack of clarity around that, admittedly. So anyway, I do want to pause for any questions or comments here. Or yeah, and if you want to unmute yourself, you could hit the little hand raise button. There's a little hand raise option near the names if you click on the attendees tab. Or you could just come in and type in a question, or you could say one. Because as you know, I could just talk. I could do this for 10 hours, by the way. So I like hearing from other people. Okay, doesn't look like it. No questions. Oh, here we go. Maybe we do. I've not heard of cat. Thank you. Okay. Oh, I missed a question. It said, what are some reactions I get when people see marijuana as Schedule 1? Yeah, that's an interesting one because you know that people. Well, I find that students get mad about it. Some students will be mad about that, and then they'll say that's BS, and because of that, they'll use it as fuel to smoke more weed, and sort of say, well, I'm going to rebel against this because I'm pissed about the fact that this is Schedule 1 and it shouldn't be. So there's usually that reaction that I'll get. I'll talk about it. I'll sort of reframe it and ask if there was no such thing as drug scheduling and every drug in the world was like tomatoes and you could just grow your own, or there's sort of a regulation if they're sold in the store. But if everything was legal, what would you do, right? Would you smoke more or less? Would you use methamphetamine? What would you do? You know what? Let's think critically about that a little bit. Are you using this as a way to fuel you for that? My general thought is I do think we should. You asked kind of my opinion on that. What's my response? I think at this point, if we continue to see, it's tough because we have certain drugs in Schedule 2 that we know anyone who works in the world of drugs and pharmacology and addiction and recovery, there's a lot of drugs in Schedule 2 and 3 and 4 that cause a lot of problems in people's lives. And so I think it's tricky, right? I think it would eliminate, if we're trying to look holistically also at drugs and think about social justice and law and all this stuff, if it was Schedule 2, it would sort of eliminate some of this tension between state and federal law. It could get that better aligned. I don't know, and then I feel conflicted because I know sometimes where it's legal for a while, at least, there's a little uptick in interest of young people. Perception of harm goes down, which usually means use goes up. So there's a mix, there's a mix that will happen. Okay. Any other questions? Any in the chat? No? Okay. Okay. So here we go. We'll continue. I sometimes just put a beautiful picture when I'm transitioning topics. So here we are, the Redwoods. This is near where I live. If you never get a chance to go to the Redwoods, highly recommend it. Beautiful, beautiful place. Let's talk about opioids for a moment, if we can, because there's so many synthetics related to this, and all of it is based on this kind of fascinating plant. And when you look at this plant, we have these phases of this plant. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but it flowers, and then the flowers fall off, and there becomes this stage, the fourth one from the left, where it's green and bulbous before it dries out. That's what we're going to talk about. If it dries and dries and dries all the way to the right, that is then where poppy seeds are produced, and it looks like that. Once they're dry and you shake those out, a ton of poppy seeds will come out of that plant. And there are two, this is what it looks like in the field. This is what it looks like then when it's in that bulbous state. And to get opium out of this plant, people cut it. And if you cut it too deep, you kill the plant. If you don't cut it deep enough, none of that milk will leak out of it. So people cut it, they make an incision in it, they go back the next day, it's going to turn a dark color, and then they scrape it off there. It's sort of a milky but hardened dark color. That's raw opium. And then from that, people will break that down into pure morphine, and then from morphine you can make heroin. So this is the process of that. This whole world of opioids is very complex, but it's all sort of fundamentally rooted on this plant. So remember this idea of a plant and then something mimicking that. Now in the plant, there are two primary active ingredients and alkaloids. One is morphine and the other is codeine. So again, morphine on its own is much more potent than morphine when it is mixed in with other compounds in the plant. So those are the two natural compounds from this. And back in the day, you used to be able to order heroin online, not online, there was no internet in 1900, but you could order it by mail and it would be delivered to you, including a hypodermic needle. So it was very interesting time, right? It was very different. And then that all changed in 1914. But nonetheless, we now have tons of synthetic opioids. And these are just a few. There are, if you wanted to look at an exhaustive list, you can go to drugs.com, you can go to WebMD, these sites that I have, all these things. There's so many synthetic opioids. So some of them, when you make something that's synthetic as well, it can actually sometimes bind with a little more affinity to the opioid receptors. And it can be sometimes even more intense and more potent. And obviously we know fentanyl, which a lot of you have heard of, and it's on here, is a massive problem right now. So fentanyl is a synthetic opioid, and it's being cut in with other drugs. It's sometimes they're finding it sometimes in pills that are sold as ecstasy or Molly. They're finding it now in samples of cocaine, even though it's not a stimulant, obviously, but it's very risky. And many deaths. There was almost no deaths from fentanyl that were in toxicology reports pre-2015, and then we started to see them more and more, and then by 2016 there was over 20,000 in toxicology reports. So it's very cheap, easy to make. It gets cut in and mixed in with heroin and other opioids, and sometimes it's put in pills that are meant to look like a pharmaceutical, like an oxycodone pill or something like this. Very potent, very strong drug. Now here's where remember like the MDMA thing, what if it has an application, but then there's this total abusive misuse part of it? Same with fentanyl. Fentanyl's been around a long time. It's an old drug. It's not new. It was made in the 1960s. The UN considers fentanyl an essential medicine. If someone's in severe pain, a major car accident, many broken bones and cuts, all this, fentanyl will be given as a patch, and it's a very distinct dose that's given, and it can help with mitigating very acute, intense pain for people. But used on an unregulated way, we don't know the dose, high potential for respiratory depression, which is the slowing down and stopping of the breathing, which is a big factor in opioids and opioid overdose. This is, maybe some of you have seen this image, but this is what it looks like. This amount of heroin is essentially what would cause overdose in someone, and you can see the same, that's the amount of fentanyl that can cause overdose in someone. It's not much, so it's strong. And then carfentanil is an elephant tranquilizer. This one's not as popular. It is very potent and very high risk, but you see fentanyl more. It's made in a lot of covert labs in different parts of the world, and has become a big problem. So I know a lot of you already know about that, but that's probably the biggest synthetic opioid that we're seeing that's having the strongest impact societally right now for people. And I wanted to mention this about opioids. This is not synthetic, but it's natural, but I want to address it because students are very, very curious about this. I had a few students ask questions about this just last week at the university I was at, and this is something called kratom. Kratom is legal everywhere, and there's some actually, I take that back. It's legal on a federal level. There are some states and jurisdictions that have their own laws related to this, but mostly you can get it, you can order it online, etc. But mitragynine is the primary active alkaloid in it, and this is a very unique drug. It's biphasic. So in small amounts of this, when people take a little bit of the powder, there's three types of opioid receptors: delta, kappa, and mu. Most opioids bind to the mu receptors, and they have that sedating effect, pain relief, and kind of dreamy, euphoric sedation, sometimes nausea, etc., that comes from that. These actually bind with affinity more to the delta receptors. So in a low dose, it feels more like a mild stimulant to people. So it's biphasic, just like alcohol is biphasic. Biphasic means two phases or two parts. If someone takes a high dose of kratom, they will actually, the delta receptors sort of get filled up, so to speak, and then it moves on to the mu receptors, and therefore it can act just like any other opioid. So there is risk with that, right? There's risk of habituating to this for sure. So stimulating properties at low doses, narcotic properties at high doses. A lot of people are using kratom for opioid withdrawal. This is where it gets really interesting, yet there's risk. It can be habit forming. And the DEA put kratom on emergency schedule 1, I believe it was 2016 or 2017. And there were so many people that wrote letters that said, I got off heroin using kratom, now I don't use it anymore, or my brother's using this to help with oxycodone, etc. That the DEA actually removed it from Schedule 1 and left it unscheduled and said, well, we'll do more research. I think that was a function of people seeing how intense the opioid epidemic that we have seen is. And they've also, I think, just said, if there's something that could potentially help, I guess let's look at this. So right now it's just unscheduled. There's curiosity about it. Again, it's not a synthetic, but it's related to the opioid thing, which is, it's something we need to be, again, I think should be thinking about. Okay, so another beautiful picture. This is close to my house too. Nice 6-mile hike to get to this lake, and you jump in and you're so refreshed. It's amazing. And I'm such an advocate of students getting outside when we're outside. Things can really balance for us. And I think the best form of prevention is being a healthy person and thriving in your life and staying hydrated and getting enough sleep and getting outside and moving our bodies to the best of our abilities and expressing our emotions and being human and having social connections. So there's my little soapbox, but I love going outside. It's a balance point for me in my life. And so I'm always encouraging this with students. Okay, so there's a pretty picture. Now we're going to talk about synthetic cannabinoids, and I want to set this up by talking about natural cannabinoids. So this is a cannabis flower. The male plant does not flower. The female plant does flower. And this is what it looks like when it's flowering. Where I live, it is legal and it grows everywhere. The climate here is sort of perfect for growing this plant, so I see it around all the time. When you zoom in, this is what it looks like up close, those flowers, and you can start to see these little crystals on these flowers. These are called trichomes, and those little trichomes, these bulbous structures, contain all the cannabinoids. It was thought at one time there's like 50 cannabinoids, and then we're like, oh no, there's 80. Oh no, there's 104. Oh, maybe there's 120. So there's a lot of cannabinoids, or some of them are each an individual chemical, so to speak, of the plant. The one you've heard of the most is THC, because it is psychoactive. You're hearing more about CBD. And CBD is not psychoactive, but people are using it for different medical applications. So what's interesting about these cannabinoids, though, is that depending when the plant is harvested, they have a different effect on the user. You see some of these cannabinoids or some of these trichomes are clear. When they're totally all clear, the flower is really young and the THC has not been fully developed. But if once they become this milky color that a lot of these are, then the THC is at its peak. And then when it turns, and they're like that for about 3 weeks, and then if you wait after that 3 weeks, the trichomes will start to turn an amber color, this reddish color, and the THC at that point has started to degrade. And another cannabinoid, CBN, becomes more prominent. It's a byproduct of THC degradation, and CBN is sedating. So here's where this gets interesting. No matter what the strain name is, if it's like, oh, that's a sativa and it's uplifting, or that's an indica and it's sedating, that may not matter at all. What may matter more is when the person harvested this. If they harvested it, I could have 2 plants growing in my yard, same strain, same soil, same watering. I harvest one, I hang it up to cure, and then immediately I get called out of town for 30 days on an emergency. I come back and harvest the other one, hang it to cure, same room, everything. They will have very, very different effects on the user. One's going to be more sedating and one may not be. So it's very interesting, this whole thing around strain names, and this strain name does this and this and this and this. A lot of that's found to not really be true. A friend of mine did genetic research and genetic mapping on a particular strain that they got samples from all over the country, and none of them looked the same. So it was like, well, which one's the true strain? And if we go on a website and say this strain is good for that, this strain is good for that, is it? Not sure. So it's a good thing to critique this, but a lot of the industry is sort of based on this. So let's continue into our exploration. You can then take so this is what this flower looks like when it's cured and dried and trimmed, and it's got those cannabinoids, that some of those trichomes have been maintained. People smoke that, right? Or you can make it into edibles, or you can make it into concentrates. So these concentrates like shatter or glass, butter, whatever they may be, and people call that smoking dabs. Now, what I want you to consider is that this right here, in the 1970s, the THC levels were about 1 to 2% on average. Now, the average THC level is about 15 to 20%. And anybody know what the THC level is of the concentrates? You want to throw that in on either the chat or the question? Give a guess. Let me know you're still engaged with me. And throw something in there. What do you think the average THC levels are for this? I'm giving you a minute to find it and to do it. Oh, I think we got one. All right, we got some. 60% high. Yes, 60%, 70%, 25%, 50 plus. Okay, good. Awesome. Love it. 48, very precise. Love that. They are ranging about 60 to 90% THC. So you've completely created a new product, and we're going to talk in a little bit about the entourage effect and why that matters, and it relates to synthetic cannabinoids. So I do want to, just for your clarity, because students have a lot of questions, people have a lot of questions, I want to divert and talk 3 minutes about CBD. What the hell is CBD? What's going on with this? Where does it come from? Why is it suddenly everywhere? And how is that possible? Is it legal? Is it illegal? Okay, so if a cannabis product contains less than 0.03% THC, it is considered to be hemp. And hemp falls under the Farm Bill, and it is not under the DEA in the scheduling, the 5 schedules. So it's considered an agricultural product rather than something that would be regulated in another way. Okay, let me look. Hold on. Okay. So this is what traditional hemp looks like. When someone would grow hemp for clothing or fiber, this is what it looks like. In the Midwest, you know a lot about corn, right? So my uncle is one of the biggest corn producers in Illinois, actually. He's got thousands of acres, and you plant it, 3-4 inches apart, and it grows into these tall swaths, right? Now the male and female plants, obviously you're not going to separate those out. So if this hemp, if the female plants grow a little flower, it will quickly get pollinated and stop growing and be loaded with tons of seeds. If a cannabis flower does not get pollinated, that flower will continue to grow and become resinous and not have seeds in it. That's what people like to smoke. So this is an old picture on the left. You can see these huge structures on the upper right. There's a tractor involved, right? This is big. This is what it looked like, these tall, massive, humongous plants. But it does not look like this. This is what a marijuana plant looks like that people grow for medical or for recreational. I see plants like this all over my valley. They're huge. They're like trees, right? And these have a massive amount of space around them. They make sure there's no male plants around so they don't get pollinated and fertilized. And this these plants can yield up to 5 to 10 pounds, probably on this one here. A lot of them yield 2 to 3 pounds, but that's a lot, right? So those are big. Now there's something happening in the middle, and it looks like this. And there was over about 10,000 acres in my county growing this. It's hemp. It's called hemp, but it doesn't look like hemp like the corn. So what is this? Well, it's hemp, so to speak, being grown specifically for THC. So you can, or for CBD, my apologies. You can see the background there. The plants don't get quite as big as those massive ones, but they're certainly not looking like the corn. They kind of stay small like that, and they're all female plants. So they grow a flower on them, but the flower that is grown, it's been bred to have very little to no THC, just trace amounts. So they can take that flower and produce and extract CBD from it. So all over my valley, you see signs like this. No trespassing, don't steal this. There's no THC in it. Do not remove the plants. This is hemp. Here's another picture of it. This one is you can see it's starting to flower a little bit on the tops there. So it's starting to grow a flower. This is another picture. I took this picture. I stood on top of my car and took this picture. And this is about 20-acre field of hemp. This is on my way out. And one of my daughters is on the rowing team for high school. So there's a lake about 5 miles from us. So I was doing the carpool this day with 3 freshman girls in the car. I drove, this is just around, they see it, talk about it. Dropped them off, and on my way back I took a picture because I wanted you to see this. Now, one of the issues, you can see they mulch this with plastic. So you see all that plastic there? That's a one-time use. It's a pretty big environmental problem. That plastic just gets torn up and goes in the landfill at the end of the season. So these were flowering, they were big, they were just about to get harvested. You can see the color on the leaves were even changing. So that's what CBD is. That's where that comes from. That whole thing around CBD is from these plants that are bred specifically to have little to no THC. They have a different regulatory process because they fall under the Farm Bill. That's why you're seeing CBD stuff kind of everywhere right now. Now so circling back then to concentrates, the concentrates are, they can look like this. These look very different. Again, if these concentrates were made from high potency flowers, now they have a lot of THC in them. And when there's a high amount of THC and not the other cannabinoids, people are more likely to have a panicked, fear-based response to that. So, and I want to just say this, concentrates are not new. We have the coca plant and cocaine, like I talked about. We have opium, and you extract morphine from that. And then from that, you can make heroin, and then salvia, and then cat, which I already talked about. Now we have marijuana with all these stronger strains, and you can make oils and distillates and concentrates. So the thing is, when you take something in its natural form and you isolate something from that that's psychoactive, the problems go up significantly. I'm not saying that things in their natural form are perfect for you or safe or any of that, but just the problems go up when we extract isolated compounds from plants. So let's look at synthetic cannabinoids a little bit, right? Synthetic cannabinoids, many of these were produced originally, they came out of Clemson University. So they were trying to produce synthetic cannabinoids to be able to study them, to study, well, could there be medical applications for some of these cannabinoids? But those formulas got out, people learned about them, started making them on their own. And these are liquids that, and a lot of them are now on Schedule 1, but some are not. So some are out there still. They spray the liquid on dry plant material. People will then smoke that plant material, or you can just vape the liquid. Very unpredictable, very confusing around the dose, no standards. And a lot of variable effect to it. People have really, there's still synthetic cannabinoids are used a lot. If people are getting drug tested and they're just doing the basic panel and they're testing for cannabinoids, a lot of times these will not come up on a drug test unless they are specifically testing for it, which is really expensive and not common. So people will sometimes use it if they're being drug tested for a specific reason. Maybe something to do with probation or whatever it may be, or they're on a professional athletic team where they're getting tested, or the NCAA maybe where they're going to get tested, things like that. And what this relates to is something called the entourage effect. I'm going to try to explain this because it relates to kind of everything we're talking about. The entourage effect is essentially this idea that you have a mix of compounds in a natural product, and they all work together and intersperse in a way that sometimes some have antagonistic effects on each other, some have synergistic effects on one another. Some of the cannabinoids, like in marijuana, will actually slow down the absorption of THC. That's why when those are gone and someone's taking just pure THC in high levels, they get a massive amount of THC at once, and they can have an adverse psychological reaction to that. So they work kind of together, these compounds in these plants. There's an example of that is like beta carotene in a by itself in a supplement is found to not do very much to the body. It doesn't really help us. But beta carotene in a carrot is good for us because there's other carotenes that help that can help absorb beta carotene and make it more functional for us. So there's about 45 carotenes, I believe, in carrots, something like that, right? So you get what I'm saying here. Now, if you then take these isolated compounds, isolated cannabinoids, without the other ones there, and they're synthetic, I can completely say, yep, that's point A to point B of why people freak out and people are having adverse psychological reactions to these, because it is a different product. It acts differently on the brain. It has some activity on some of the cannabinoid receptors, but it has a mixed variability based on what it is. We don't even actually know sometimes. We don't have great research on it. And it doesn't have that full spectrum of cannabinoids mixed in with it. So it naturally is going to have more of that effect. And we see this even with natural cannabis. When those concentrates, when the THC levels are really, really high and the other cannabinoids are not really there or present in the full way, people have these reactions as well. So the risk with synthetic cannabinoids is high. And it's people have asked me, students will ask me that, like, well, if someone was going to should they just smoke regular cannabis rather than synthetic cannabinoids? I think it's kind of a trick question, right? Because then it kind of it becomes permissive if you're like, yeah, but on some level I would have to, if from a harm reduction model, if someone said it's a 1 or a 2, you have no option to say, well, don't do either. I would probably say natural cannabis has a higher safety profile than synthetic cannabinoids. And we're seeing that. Talk to people in emergency rooms, you talk to people who work as EMTs, they'll tell you, like, clearly there's people having adverse reactions to synthetic cannabinoids that they see, they show up in those places. And you can talk to counselors too, and they'll say, yeah, I've had students or clients who have had a really adverse reaction to synthetic cannabinoids, and it had a huge impact on their anxiety and mental health long term, not just while they're intoxicated, but it can serve as an exacerbating event that can lead to later psychological challenges for people as well. And the entourage effect is almost all natural compounds. So even what's interesting, remember that research I talked about that they're allowing with Schedule 1 drugs? The psilocybin research, like the study at University of Wisconsin, they gave people synthetic psilocybin. Now, if you think about that, in the mushroom, there's other compounds. There's baeocystin, there's psilocin, there's all kinds of compounds that are even recently being discovered. I just read an article 2 weeks ago, they found all these other compounds. They're not sure how those all work together, but I'm wondering if the research that's being done using just pure synthetic psilocybin is applicable to someone who's using the mushrooms. I don't know. I don't know exactly, but they're going to lack that entourage effect. So the outcome may be different. I don't know. It's something I've tried to really wrap my mind around and think about. This may be way too in the weeds, pun intended, for what we're doing today, but I hope you're still hanging with me. I like talking about it. So that's with that. Now, the one thing I want to mention with psychedelics, which I talked about, they've become more popular. There's clinical trials being conducted. There's pop culture media attention. Like Oprah Magazine did an article on MDMA years ago. CNN has done stories. the New York Times, all this stuff. Michael Pollan, a very famous author who wrote mostly about food and food systems and agriculture and sustainable agriculture, wrote a book last year called How to Change Your Mind. And it's a book all about psychedelics and psychedelic research. So it's created now even a further more pop culture media attention. And then there's this phenomenon around microdosing, which people take a small amount of a psychedelic and try to use that in some sort of cognitive performance enhancement way. It's gotten really popular. There, again, popular media attention. So with the rise of more interest around psychedelics, you're gonna get some synthetics that get born out of that. You're getting some synthetic LSD that people are selling something as LSD, but then they'll do lab analysis on it and it is not LSD. It's something mimicking that. So care has to be given to how we think about this and talk about it. I've had plenty of students, though, they'll say, hey, I really like the Joe Rogan podcast, and so it sparked my interest in psychedelics. Can we talk about it? So again, there's more and more interest in this, and I think the more versed we are in it and understanding of it, we can say, well, here's how the clinical trials go. It's very different than probably you're thinking about it. So drug testing is a piece of the synthetic world right now. There's a little documentary on YouTube I'd recommend called What's in My Baggie. And these guys go around to different music festivals, I believe in the summer of 2017, and they ask people, hey, we're not the police, but do you have drugs with you? And can we test a little bit of your drugs? Can we take maybe 10 milligrams of your powder, put it in this thing, put one or two drops on it, shake it, and it will turn a certain color. And then we'll be able to tell you, not with total precision, but at least what family that drug is in. We'd have to take it into a lab to get really specific about it, but we'd at least know if it's MDMA or not at base level. So it's a pretty fascinating little documentary. And you'll see drug testing has had it happens sometimes at music festivals. It was happening a lot in the 90s through an organization called Dance Safe, and these are their products here on the bottom right, where they would go to a rave or a festival and have a table set up, and people could get something tested in the moment, and they'd be able to tell, at least with some level of a screen, what category that drug fell in, if it was, and mainly telling if it was pure MDMA or if it was methamphetamine, something like that. So you can see on the bottom left here that is not a Frisbee. It's a small little a color card that shows, okay, if you took that liquid in that bottle, you took a little bit of a few granules of a drug, you put it in like an old film case, it looks like, put a couple drops in there, shake it up, it'll turn within 30 seconds one of these colors, and then you'll get a sense of, oh, that's actually heroin, that's mescaline, that's MDPV, that's anything in the yellow here. It could be kind of like in the especially the darker yellow, a bath salt. In the green area, we have like 2CI and 2CB, some of these other synthetics that sort of mimic, that are analogs to MDMA. And then on the top, it's hard to see that, but it's kind of purplish. You'll see MDA and MDMA. In the reddish, it's getting more like amphetamines and methamphetamine. So this is I'm hearing more talk about this, where some people are buying drug test kits online and using them to test drugs. Kind of fascinating, but there's been more synthetic drugs produced in the last 5 years and synthesized than the previous 50. So in this party scene, so we're in this kind of brave new world around chemicals and drugs, and maybe not 5 years, maybe 8 years. I should tip that back a little bit. Let's say 10 years than the previous 50. So we're in this time where there's all these different analogs and minor little molecular tweaks, and it creates a new drug. So people have to understand what they're getting into. This is where this critical thinking piece comes into. This is so it's become very complicated. So I'm a big advocate of education around this, again, for students, especially if they're curious. And there's one rub, right? We have the people on the top here who are making laws and legislation and decisions around this that impact a lot of the people here on the bottom. I couldn't get like a more different people. Now, who knows? Maybe some of the people on the top go to Burning Man. I have no idea. I've never been there, so I'm not sure. But there's a rift. There's a distinction there between culture. There's a cultural divide that is very real when it comes to drugs and when it comes to sort of how we approach them and the intermixing of law and education and therapy and all this stuff and all of it. There's a big mix and there's a big distinction there. So what next? I want to close and then have some time for questions. There's a couple things you're going to hear more about. One is called nootropics. These are a category of synthetic drugs that are specifically geared toward brain enhancement. And people are using them as a cognitive enhancer. Many are untested, many are unknown. I mean, caffeine would be essentially considered a nootropic, but if you Google nootropics, you'll find a ton of drugs, many of which are just fully kind of out there and legal. Some you can order on Amazon, and a lot don't have any human clinical trials or understanding of them. People are just sort of trusting the process. So that's one to consider. I think people are gonna, I had a student actually do a report on nootropics, and because he was curious about them, and after he did all his research, he was kind of like very concerned about them and saying, what is happening? We're just sort of trusting this process. Education, what does that look like? I think we all have to think about the values and context of our own campuses, our state we live in, other things but how do we approach education? I guess for me, I've found that if you critique Nancy Reagan, just say no, it doesn't mean you're just say yes. It means that you are wanting to empower people. And I think through knowledge and information and respect and conversation, there is that can happen, and I've seen this happen when I went to a private school in Southern California, and the students showed up really skeptical to like a drug talk, right? But then, and some of them afterward would talk to me about that, and they said, yeah, we kind of came here not knowing what to expect and thought that we would get, the finger wagging, but you were really rational and really reasonable, and we appreciated it. And they had a lot of these students hung out for an hour after and had a lot of questions, and they're just seeking to talk about this, I feel like, in a way. And I think that's why we want to honor them. And also, Google exists, so we can't just go in anymore and just lie. We could do that in 1984, right? We could go in and just lie to kids and college students, and they would sort of not know unless they're going and doing their own research. But now they can fact check you on their phone. So it's like we want to make sure that we're, and also that they're good consumers of information, and that they're finding good sources with this. And then I think we want to look at the honest research about the impacts of prohibition. Is this having an effect? Is the prohibition of cannabis leading more to synthetic cannabis, cannabinoid use, right? Is that something that's there? Let's really zoom out and take a really comprehensive view on this. I know it's tricky, and I know we all have our own personal values and thoughts around whether it should be legal or not. And I think higher ed is going to sort of have to lead that charge and say, let's look at this holistically in terms of the health implications, but also the criminal side of it. And you look at the illegal grow operations on the West Coast in California, the environmental damage that happens in the national forest, that's real. Some of that's a consequence of unintended consequence of prohibition. So I know the easy answer is just, hey, nobody uses cannabis, doesn't matter. I know that, I understand it, but let's really think about it comprehensively. I don't know the answer to that one. I just throw it out there as a potential place of research. And again, I love talking about this with students. My biggest thing is that wellness equals prevention. When we are in that state of wellness, we feel usually content emotionally, physically, etc., and mentally, and it's a great form of prevention for people, or at least critical thought if we're experimenting around things. And I want to close with this. I think when we think about drugs in general, this was a quote from Johann Hari. He wrote a book called Chasing the Scream, and he wrote another one called Lost Connections about depression. And this is oversimplified, right? It's more than that. But the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. There's actually more that goes into addiction and sobriety, but this is just a quote he talks about related to social connection. We know that social connection is going down. In the US, loneliness and social isolation and depression are going up, although we have all these devices telling us that we should be more connected through them. Fascinating research. A good comprehensive meta-analysis done in 2019 found adolescents who are high in social media use and low in in-person interaction have the highest levels of loneliness. So it goes, when we relate this to drugs, there was a study done in the 1970s, called Rat Park. These researchers took rats and they put them in a really beautiful, in Canada, they put them in a beautiful environment with other rats. They were social, they gave them healthy food, they could exercise and move around, and they gave them access to drugs like morphine. And none of the rats used the drug. Some tried it, but none of them used them compulsively, let alone to the point of overdose or compulsive use. But then if they would take a rat out and isolate it, put it in a cage by itself, freak it out, provoke anxiety, they would, and then give them access to the drugs, they would use it a lot, very abusively, etc. They would take then they would take those rats, put them back in this nice environment, and almost none of them used the drugs. So there was something about the social part and the health part that was preventative. It's interesting. Now, I don't want to relate our brains to rat brains, but we're sort of similar. So anyway, in 1970, this man, Richard Nixon, passed an act, the Comprehensive Drug Act. This was really rooted in compassion originally because he was looking at Vietnam veterans coming back from Vietnam, about 20% of which were addicted to heroin. So he signed this with the intention of treatment and education for them. And what it merged more into enforcement as the 70s went on, and then especially as we got into the 80s, it got really into enforcement, but originally was born out of this place of compassion. Interestingly enough, when there's a chapter in Gabor Mate's book called From Rat Park to Vietnam, the book is called In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts. It's one of the best books on addiction I've ever read, but he talks about in that time, after a short time of getting back from Vietnam, the addiction rate went to about 1%. So once soldiers got back into their families, their neighborhoods, their communities, that without a lot of intervention and treatment, that the rate went down to 1%. So again, that you were in a high stress environment that was losing meaning, you had high availability to this drug, and then when you came back, we were at a different place. So I think the social connection piece, we're going to have to continue to wrap our minds around, I think, relating that to substance use and drug use and other addictions, like addictions to being online or gaming or shopping or whatever, gambling, whatever it may be, how that manifests. But this piece of social connection, how we're wired for that, is vital. This is a picture of Central Oregon. That's my lovely partner, Lydia. I just want to give you one more beautiful picture. We were backpacking along the Pacific Crest Trail. And this is my email. It's up there again. That's my website. I hate this being self-promotional, but I will tell you, I do a lot of presentations. I need to update my website. There's about 10 on there. I haven't updated since June, but I go to high school, private high school. Sometimes I go to a lot of universities. I go to conferences, and I do staff trainings with student affairs folks. Then I'll usually do something for maybe student athletes or the Greek students or just general students or all that. I like to do those sessions. I'm only about 6 months behind on this, but I have a project called the Cannabis Classroom. It's an online education module or program. It takes about an hour to complete. So similar to like all the other substance use online education modules that are created, I wanted to create one that I felt was going to be really straightforward, talking about cannabis use, but not only that, but talking about identity and social norms and health and wellness, and there's a section on concentrates and edibles, and just being able to, in every section has a video. We wanted to keep it pretty like engaging in that way. So the demo for this should be ready in about 2 weeks. That's my goal. I put that as my new goal. 2019's been awesome and busy, I gotta say. So I got behind on this project, but I really want to make sure it's right. So, but we're really, really close. So I'm excited about that. So if you were curious to see the demo of that, you could also email me and let me know. And if you want that document that I put out at the beginning, email me and I'll send that to you as well. So I want to thank you. I'll put this last slide back up, and I just want to show you this fun little slide here. There we go. I want to thank you for being on the session. We do have about 8 minutes if people have questions, and I'll just open it up. So I'll put this one back. There we go. That's very fun. Again, my website, my email. But if you have some questions or comments or anything at all, you can chat them in, or you can put them in the question box. And I know Grace may have a few things for housekeeping at the end, but I wanted to just take a little time. If you have comments or questions, go for it. And hopefully you learned one thing.
Matt, I appreciate your training today. It was very insightful. I learned a lot of good information. I'm sure everyone else has too. Uh, I definitely am going to go through a few housekeeping things with everyone in about an hour. You will, everybody that's logged in will get a evaluation form about today's training. Please fill that out because we do go and read those and take them very seriously. And we also share those with the trainers so they know how they're doing as well. We also will have certificates for CEUs mailed out or emailed out, I'm sorry, 7 to 10 business days from the date of this webinar, and we will get those to you. Any other questions for Matt today? He did a great job, very thorough, and wonderful information. Thank you so much, Matt.
Yeah, no problem. No problem. It's always tricky to know on a webinar how I'm engaging with people. I didn't see a lot of people drop off, which was great. But yeah, I love talking about this stuff. I'm really passionate about it, and but yeah, I'm open to any questions, any comments in the last couple minutes.
Anybody have any questions? Anything that you're curious about that you need him to elaborate on, or just even resources that he could maybe share with us?
Is there a hand up maybe from one person? Oh, there's a question maybe. Okay. How would I open a conversation with someone that is engaging in some of these drugs? Yeah, so that's a good question. I think because that will happen sometimes, and I will often want to get more information. First of all, what's the frequency of their doing it? What's their motivation? What's their take on it? What is the impact from their perspective? A lot of times, I want to assess their level of self-awareness relating to it. I'll also then ask a lot of questions around safety. All those questions on that sheet, that document. What's your health like? What's your mental health like? Are you on any pharmaceutical drugs? Are you, those types of questions I think are really important to get at to just assess risk. I would always, and then I'd want to talk through it. I'd want to talk through the safety, the motivation, the set and the setting, all of those dynamics. I think I always would want to offer to people if you're engaging in this, everything carries risk. You can do all the harm reduction methods you want in the world. You cannot take your risk to 0 out of 0. So I'll acknowledge that with them, and I'll also talk about, I think it's really important for me to have in that conversation somewhere resources. So whether that's mental health professionals on campus, myself, the Student Support and Intervention Office, off-campus resources, I think those are always really important, because at that time a student may not perceive a challenge or issue. I may, and especially if I see like this is really problematic use and very chronic, I will sometimes openly talk about that and state that. But I think without the sort of, I think I also keep in mind that for that student to ask about that, there's a certain level of trust that's there and a certain level of vulnerability for them. So I want to empathize around that. And yet I want to make sure that I'm providing good information and potential resources for them. Okay, so then someone asked about CBD for anxiety. It's interesting. I know that some people will use it for that, and there's pretty mixed results. I wonder if, placebo is one of the most powerful forces in medicine. So I think part of the CBD thing is placebo. I think some of it we do actually need more research on, but it depends. Some people don't find much luck with it. Others do, but I don't know that we have the greatest body of knowledge and evidence to really understand that. There's also some speculation that CBD, even in isolation without just a little bit of THC, is not quite as impactful. So who knows about that? It's also contraindicated with grapefruit. I don't know, it's random. A lot of drugs are like that. If you eat grapefruit, it changes the metabolites in your some of the metabolism or the enzymes, I'm sorry, in your liver. And so CBD can have an adverse reaction if people take it with grapefruit. Random people don't know that. No problem. Someone just said thank you. I appreciate that as well. I would my final answer on the CBD is we need more research. Clearly, I do think there's potential, and I think some of the potential comes from the anti-seizure properties. Some people have had really good luck, especially some children, related to that in certain states where they can get it medically. Doesn't work for everybody. It's not 100%. So, but if something works at what percent of people do we consider that evidence? That's a good question. So if 40% of people find real benefit if they have Dravet syndrome or other seizure disorders, I don't know, then what do we do with that? So I think having options on the table for people is a pretty compassionate approach in general. I would say that. Okay, I think we're at time. Thanks everybody. I really appreciate you hanging on the call and being on the webinar. And yeah, thank you so much. I hopefully I'll hear from some of you and connect with you if you want that resource or just connect in general. So thank you all.
Thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. If you have any questions or would like any more information from Matt, please get a hold of us. We'd be happy to help and assist you to getting that information. Also, we will have this webinar available on our website for future viewing. And thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful holiday break. Thank you, Matt.
Yep, thank you.